are Sylvia Plath, another later 20th century female author, and the two works of hers that we read this week, Edge and Metaphors. I think you're going to really enjoy Metaphors. Actually, it's kind of fun. It's like a little riddle that you get to figure out the answer to. So that's kind of fun if you like riddles. And then Edge is a little darker, yeah. Well, but it is Sylvia Plath, another confessional poet, and another poet, much like Anne Sexton and some of the other writers we've read about, dealt with a lot of depression and, yeah, a lot going on. So her life ended tragically, as I mentioned earlier when we talked about Anne Sexton. Those two were friends, and they ended their lives in similar ways. If you look at, actually, there are a lot of similarities in their lives. If you look at the written out lecture, there is a lovely photo of Sylvia Plath. She's very young in it. Makes it even sadder to think how young she was when she died. Tragic, tragic life here. You can see the era. It looks as if it's the 1960s, I believe. The photo was taken. She died in 1963, so it was either late 1950s or early 1960s when this photo was taken. I'd say probably the early 60s is what it looks like. So check out the photo. The printed out lecture also has several links if you'd like to know more about Sylvia Plath's life or her works. You can check out those links. They got a lot of good information and links to other works of hers too. There's a very touching NPR interview with Frida Hughes, Sylvia Plath's daughter, who was 2 years old and sleeping in the house when her mother, Sylvia Plath, actually committed suicide. That was Sylvia Plath's daughter with Ted Hughes that she had. The interview discusses Frida's release of Plath's original manuscript for Plath's highly autobiographical collection of poems called Ariel, which contains the poem Edge that we read for class this week. There's a YouTube link that's a recorded interview from 1961 with both Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, the person that, who's the father of, their child, Frida Hughes, discussing their lives and poetry composition after they had already gotten married. Baby Frida, 9 months old, about 2 years before Plath took her life. Another NPR interview, actually, there's a link to, about Sylvia Plath's enduring influence in several media forms, including a recording of Sylvia herself reading her poem, Daddy. Another really interesting poem. And a YouTube clip with a panel discussion on both Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton by, interestingly, fellow female contemporary poets Brenda Hillman, C.D. Wright, and Sharon Olds. And another YouTube clip by noted author John Green. You may know him. He's a popular young adult writer who has written, he's not a young adult, he writes for young adults. He's written several books that have become extremely popular for teens and young adults. They've been made into movies. Paper Towns, The Fault in Our Stars, those movies, or books, as you may know them. Anyway, he's got his crash course, John Green's crash course on Sylvia Plath's poetry. So that's a fun one to check out. He delivers it in a very engaging and approachable manner, so you might enjoy that. Then there's a YouTube clip that dramatizes a reading of the Plath poem that we read for class this week, or one of the poems, called Edge. So that might help you either read through the poem and then watch the clip, and then read through the poem again to understand it just a little bit more. So, but I always say read the poem first so that it doesn't spoil any of it for you. So you can make your you don't have preconceived notions of interpretation and understanding of the poem first. Then there's a YouTube clip featuring Sylvia Plath reading her own poem called The Stones. And there's a YouTube link that includes a trailer for the BBC movie Sylvia, called Sylvia for Sylvia Plath's name. It's obviously a biographical movie of Sylvia Plath, and it stars actually Gwyneth Paltrow as Sylvia Plath, who looks a lot like her. Actually, they do a great job. And it also stars James Bond's Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig played James Bond most recently. And then there's a YouTube playlist of various scenes from the aforementioned movie Sylvia, although I don't believe it's the complete movie. But who knows? You might be able to find it or buy it on Amazon or Netflix or something like that if you're interested in watching the whole movie. I've never actually seen the movie, but I'm interested in seeing it. Yeah, sounds engaging. So Sylvia Plath, although sad. It's hard to watch things like that, right? When she dies so tragically and suffers so much. Sylvia Plath, she's an American poet. She lived from 1932 until 1963, tragically only until 30 years old, when Sylvia took her own life by placing her head in an oven and gassing herself to death. She had used towels to seal off the room from the rest of the house so that her two young sleeping children at the time would not suffer and die from the gas. She also left out mugs of milk and bread for her children to eat when they awoke, because she wouldn't be there for them anymore. Her children, Frida and Nicholas, were respectively 2 years old and not even a year old when they lost their mother in this fashion. At this point, Sylvia was separated from her famous British poet husband, Ted Hughes. Talked about him earlier. Because of an affair that he was having with fellow poet Asia Weevil, who was pregnant with his child at the time. After Sylvia's suicide, Asia aborted that child. Asia later bore daughter Shura with Ted Hughes. In 1969, however, Asia took her own life and the life of her 4-year-old daughter, Shura. Like Sylvia before her and Anne Sexton later on, Asia gassed herself. And she did it in the same fashion as Plath. It was with the oven. However, Asia also gassed her daughter with the oven at the same time, although Asia took sleeping pills first. Despite her tragic end, Sylvia was a high achiever. She was born in Massachusetts to equally hardworking parents, Otto Plath, who was an entomologist at Boston University, and Aurelia Plath, her mother, a secretarial skills instructor at Boston University. Tragically, her father died of gangrenous complications from diabetes when Sylvia was only 8 years old. So maybe that's where some of this tragedy and dysfunctionalism started that so gripped Sylvia. Although I'll tell you, her married life did not sound easy. I can only sympathize with what she went through. So Sylvia's mother was left to raise Sylvia and encourage Sylvia to write from a young age. Again, there's that encouragement to write that, would help maybe these girls or women, some of them are older women when they start writing as therapy, to deal with these emotions and these hard things that they're going through. It's such a shift from what we saw earlier with women who were told, oh, don't do anything intellectual at all. Give yourself the rest cure when you're suffering from depression or, whatever the nervous condition or hysteria, as they call it for women, so often in history. So now at least there's that shift that we saw with Susan Glaspell and other authors who use writing as a form of therapy and confession and creativity. And remember Kate Chopin, her Dr. Kolbenheimer encouraged her to write as therapy after her father, or not her father, after her husband died. Her father died also. And then her mother died. Her great grandmother died that raised her, and her mother died. She had a lot of deaths she was dealing with. And Kate Chopin's doctor, opposite of what Charlotte Perkins Gilman's doctor had told her. Gilman's doctor had said, "Hey, don't write, don't do anything, don't challenge yourself, just be on bed rest." Whereas Kate Chopin's doctor said, "You need to write. You need to do something. You need to get this out." And give yourself something to focus on. Um, so her mother encouraged her to write, Sylvia's mother, that is. Um, Early motivation paid off when Sylvia published a number of pieces in such famous magazines as 17. By the time she herself was actually 17. So that's kind of a neat accomplishment to be published in the magazine 17 when you're 17, right? Don't know how many people do that. However, the loss of her father continued to haunt Sylvia in such later works as the disturbing poem Daddy, which I had mentioned earlier. There was an audio recording of that you can listen to. Well, it's Sylvia Plath reading it. Sylvia attended Smith College on scholarship and was selected to be one of 12 student guest editors of Mademoiselle magazine in New York City, another really famous and prestigious magazine. So while she was in college, she was offered that opportunity. Sylvia's novel, The Bell Jar, really, really famous novel, and that was also made into a movie. It transcribes this experience. It's very autobiographical, along with its crass commercialism and empty professionalism. Not the novels, empty professionalism, but her time that she spent at Mademoiselle. It was filled with crash commercialism and empty professionalism for Sylvia Plath, at least. After her internship, Sylvia attempted suicide. She was institutionalized for a year and was subjected to electroshock therapy there. However, Sylvia returned to Smith College and actually graduated summa cum laude, which means, the highest honors at the university. And then she won a prestigious Fulbright scholarship to Cambridge University in England, where she met her future husband and the future poet laureate of England, Ted Hughes. So that's kind of like, remember how we said Gwendolyn Brooks was like the kind of like the equivalent of that in the United States, the poet for the Library of Congress. Well, Ted Hughes became the poet laureate of England, and she met and married Ted Hughes, although he wasn't the poet laureate at the time. While Sylvia lived in Massachusetts, she took poetry workshops with Robert Lowell. Remember, we talked about Robert Lowell earlier, related to Amy Lowell, the poet that we studied in the early 20th century. And another fellow confessional poet, and also Anne Sexton was involved in his circles as well. And she became close friends with Anne Sexton there, who later unfortunately followed Sylvia's own suicide example. That was Anne Sexton, of course. Near the end of Sylvia's life, when she was caring for her two children by herself, because Ted Hughes was having an affair with somebody else who had moved out, and having a child with somebody else, I couldn't even imagine, you know. Um, Actually, during this time period, Sylvia hit the poetic stride of composing 2 and 3 poems a day. And perhaps that's a reflection of how much she was suffering, that she was writing that much. She needed that much creative outlet, that she was writing two to three poems a day, which is an amazing amount. These poems were confessional and informed often by themes of death, but also by the resolution to triumph over adversity, including mental illness, as is the poem we read for class, Edge, which is published in 1963, written only 6 days before Sylvia took her own life. The other poem we read of Sylvia's, Metaphors, published in 1959, so 4 years before she died, confesses the changes Sylvia's own body was undergoing when she wrote it. You'll see why. See what I mean? It's that metaphor or that riddle that comes across through a series of metaphors in her poem Metaphors. It's quite an enjoyable poem. And then Edge isn't as enjoyable because it's so dark, because it's written in the 6 days before she ended up taking her life, and you see themes that occur in that poem that mirror what actually happened. So I invite you to read more of Sylvia Plath's life in the anthology, and the 2 poems. Metaphors is not in the anthology; it's in the week's folder, so you can find it there and at the course schedule bottom.